My friend, pull up a chair and listen close, because the story of Dorcas Ellery is not the one you think you know. It starts in a dusty town called Stillwater Creek, a place where secrets were buried deeper than the wells. Dorcas was a seamstress, see? Just a woman with nimble fingers and a heart that had been broken one too many times. She spent her days stitching dreams for other women, pinning lace and pearls onto gowns she could never afford, for lives she would never lead. And on this particular sun-scorched afternoon, she was finishing the most magnificent dress of her career, a cascade of ivory satin and seed pearls, a gown commissioned for a woman she'd never met, a Boston socialite named Eugenia Peton. This Eugenia was a ghost in their town, a whisper on the wind. She was traveling west to marry the most powerful man in the territory, Orville Hask, owner of the Lazy H Ranch, a cattle baron whose family name was basically law in those parts. Everyone in Stillwater Creek was buzzing. They were stringing up lanterns, roasting a whole steer in the town square. They were all ready for a party. But Dorcas, she just felt tired. 27 years old, and all she had to show for it were calloused fingers and the ghost of a man named Jeremiah, who'd left her standing all alone at this very same church 2 years prior. She stitched away the memories, one tiny perfect stitch at a time. The gown was her masterpiece. Fit for a queen, she wrapped it in muslin, a precious, heartbreaking bundle, and prepared to carry it to the church. As she stepped out into the golden light, the whole town was alive with a frantic energy. She saw Sheriff Miller polishing his boots, in the school marm, Ethelinda Crane directing the church choir. Ethelinda stopped her, her eyes sparkling with gossip. "I hear the bride is a true beauty," she whispered, "though no one's seen anything but a tiny portrait Mr. Haskey keeps." Dorcas just nodded. She didn't want to talk about the woman who was about to step into the life she'd always dreamed of. She had a job to do. But as she walked toward that church, a cold knot formed in her stomach, a feeling that something was deeply, terribly wrong. She told herself it was just jealousy, a bitter pill she'd swallowed many times before. She was wrong. It wasn't jealousy, it was a premonition. And by the time the sun set, that beautiful dress would be worn, a wedding would happen, and a river of blood and lies would begin to flow through the Stillwater Creek. The bride was coming, all right? But she wasn't the one anybody was expecting. The church bells were tolling 4 o'clock as Dorcas slipped into the back room, the bride's antechamber. She hung the magnificent gown on a hook, letting the train pool on the floor like liquid moonlight. She smoothed the veil, her heart aching with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. It was perfect, a testament to her skill, a monument to another woman's happiness. And that's when a deep voice from the doorway made her jump. "It's magnificent." She turned, and her breath caught in her throat. It was him. Orville Hask. He was taller than she remembered, with shoulders as broad as a barn door and eyes the color of a gathering storm. He was the man at the center of all this chaos, the groom. He held his hat in his hands, looking not at the dress, but at her. "Thank you, Mr. Haskey," she managed, dipping into a little curtsy. "I hope your bride will be pleased." But the look on his face wasn't one of a happy groom. There was a shadow in those stormy eyes, a tightness around his jaw. He looked trapped. "Are you excited to meet her?" Dorcas asked, instantly regretting how personal the question was. Orville's smile was a thin, brittle thing. "She comes from good stock. Her father is a business associate," he said, his voice flat. "A good match for the Haskey name. Not exactly the words of a man deeply in love." Dorcas felt a pang of pity, not for herself this time, but for him, and for the Boston socialite who was marrying a name, not a man. "I'm sure she'll be lovely," she offered. He just nodded, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "Thank you again, Miss Ellery. Your craftsmanship is unparalleled." And then he was gone, striding down the church aisle with the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. Dorcas watched him go, a strange feeling settling over her. She touched the small silver locket she always wore, her mother's last gift. "We make do with the cards we're dealt," her mother used to say. Orville Hask had been dealt a royal flush, but he looked like a man who was about to lose everything. By 5:30, the church was packed. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and dust and anticipation. Dorcas had changed into her one good navy blue dress and found a spot in the back, a ghost at the feast. But the stagecoach, the one carrying the beautiful Miss Petton, was now over an hour late. Whispers started to ripple through the pews like a prairie wind. Orville stood at the altar, his face a mask of stone. But it was his father, Lemuel Corbett Haska, who held Dorcas's attention. The old man was carved from granite, with eyes like chips of ice. He kept pulling out his gold pocket watch, his irritation growing with every tick. Then at 10 minutes to 6, the church doors flew open with a bang that made everyone gasp. It wasn't the bride. It was a boy from the telegraph office, sprinting down the aisle, his face pale with panic, a yellow slip of paper clutched in his fist. "Mr. Hask!" the boy gasped out, skidding to a halt. "Urgent telegram, sir." A dead silence fell over the church. Every eye was on Orville as he took the telegram and unfolded it. Dorcas watched his face. She saw the color drain from it. She saw his jaw clench so hard a muscle jumped. He didn't say a word. He just handed the telegram to his father. Old man Lemuel read it, and his face went dark. Not with disappointment, not with anger, but with something that looked chillingly like satisfaction. He stood up, his voice booming through the silent church. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "there's been an incident. The stagecoach was found overturned 5 miles out of town. There were signs of a struggle. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The driver is dead," Lemuel continued, his voice cold as ice. "And Miss Petton is missing." The word hung in the air, terrible and final. Missing. Not late. Not a runaway bride. A victim. A potential tragedy. But as Dorcas watched the Haskey men, a terrible thought crept into her mind. They didn't look like victims. They looked like predators who had just lost their prey. Chaos erupted. People were shouting, women were crying. Sheriff Miller was already barking orders, trying to form a posse. But Orville and Lemuel Hask just stood there, unnervingly calm in the eye of the storm. And that's when it happened. In the middle of all that confusion, Lemuel's icy gaze swept across the crowd and locked directly onto Dorcas. He saw her standing there in the back, small and silent and overlooked. And a look of pure, cold calculation crossed his face. He started walking toward her, purposefully. The crowd parted for him like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea. He stopped right in front of her, so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Miss Ellery," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You made the gown, did you not?" Dorcas could only nod, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no idea where this was going, but every instinct screamed at her to run. "It would be your size, I imagine," the old man continued, his eyes raking over her frame, assessing her like she was a piece of livestock. I suppose," she stammered. "My son has been disgraced," Lemuel said, his voice dropping even lower, laced with steel. "But more than that, our business arrangement with the Petton family is now in jeopardy. The entire territory will be talking by morning. The Haskell name will be mud." His eyes bored into hers. Unless what, Mr. Hask?" Dorcas whispered, her mouth suddenly dry as dust. A terrible, impossible idea was starting to form in her mind. "Unless," Lemuel said, squaring his shoulders. "There is a wedding today, after all." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Dorcas gripped the back of a pew to keep from falling. "You can't be serious," she breathed. "Deadly serious," he snapped. "Think, girl. A tragedy has occurred. My son is heartbroken. But in his grief, he realizes the woman he was meant to be with has been here all along. The humble, devoted seamstress. It's the perfect story. It turns disaster into romance. It saves my family's honor and our financial future. But your son, the missing woman." "My son will do as he's told," Lemuel cut her off. "And Miss Petton is, for all intents and purposes, gone. This is the only way forward." Dorcas looked past him, toward the altar. Orville was watching them. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold control. When their eyes met, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He was in on it. This wasn't a proposal. It was an order. A strange, chilling calm washed over Dorcas. This was insane. It was a lie. A monstrous, cold-blooded deception built on a woman's tragic disappearance. But as she stood there, caught in the old man's terrifying gaze, she thought of her life. A lonely room above her shop, an empty future. This was a cage, yes, but it was a gilded one. It was a chance to escape. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to find out what really happened to Eugenia Patton. Because one thing was crystal clear in that moment. The Haskey family was hiding something. Something dark. Very well, she heard herself say, her own voice sounding like a stranger's. I'll do it. A new wave of gas rippled through the church as the word spread. The seamstress was taking the missing bride's place. Before she could process it, she was whisked into the antechamber, surrounded by women who were suddenly her new best friends, helping her into the gown she had finished just hours ago. The gown made for a missing woman. As she stepped out, the ivory satin rustling around her, she felt less like a bride and more like a sacrificial lamb being led to the altar. The organ swelled, a triumphant, sickening sound. Dorcas walked down that aisle alone. Every eye in town was on her, a mixture of shock, pity, and greedy curiosity on their faces. At the altar stood Orville. As she reached him, he leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. I owe you a debt, Miss Ellery, he whispered. His voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. Dorcas, she whispered back, a flicker of defiance in her soul. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. The ceremony was a blur. Vows were spoken, lies were told. A ring meant for Eugenia Patton was slipped onto her finger. It was cold and heavy. When Reverend Winters pronounced them husband and wife, Orville leaned in for the obligatory kiss. His lips were dry and cool, a brief, passionless press against hers. There was no warmth, no spark, nothing. It was the sealing of a contract, a business transaction. As they turned to face the crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Orville Hask, Dorcas felt a terrifying sense of finality. She had just bound herself to a family with a dark secret, a powerful, ruthless family that would do anything to protect its name. The reception in the town square felt like a fever dream. People congratulated them, their eyes filled with questions they didn't dare ask. Orville led her through their first dance, his hand a formal, proper weight on her waist. He held her at a respectable distance, as if she were a stranger, which of course she was. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low and flat. It's been unexpected, she replied, the understatement of the century. A humorless smile touched his lips. That's one word for it. I apologize for my father's methods. He can be persuasive. He's protecting his family, Dorcas said, testing him, watching his face. Yes, Orville said, his eyes going distant. He always does. The dance ended, and the rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced smiles and polite conversation. Lemuel made a brief toast to the surprising and joyous union, his words dripping with an irony that only Dorcas seemed to catch. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the shadows. As the moon rose high over Stillwater Creek, Dorcas found herself being helped into Orville's wagon. It was time to go to her new home, her new life, the life that had belonged to Eugenia Patton. As they rode out of town, away from the warm glow of the lanterns, a heavy silence fell between them. Dorcas clutched her shawl, a sudden chill running through her that had nothing to do with the night air. She had just married a handsome, wealthy rancher. It was the stuff of fairy tales. But as she glanced at the stranger sitting beside her, his face a grim silhouette against the starry sky, she knew this was no fairy tale. It was the beginning of a nightmare. The ranch house isn't far, Orville said, his voice startling her out of her thoughts. It's modest. I built it myself. My father prefers the main homestead, but I like my own space. His attempt at small talk felt hollow, rehearsed. As they crested a rise, she saw it. A simple, solid-looking house nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. A single lantern burned in the window, a lonely beacon in the vast, dark prairie. It looked peaceful, but Dorcas knew better. Nothing about this night was peaceful. Orville helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal. Inside, the house was clean and masculine. A large stone hearth dominated the main room. There were fresh wildflowers in a vase on the table, a small, jarring touch of care in the otherwise sterile environment. The bedroom is through there, he said, gesturing to a closed door. It's prepared for you. I'll take the sofa. Of course he would. This wasn't a marriage. It was a performance. And the performance was over for the night. You don't have to give up your bed, she said, more out of politeness than any real desire to share it with him. Please, he said, cutting her off gently. It's the least I can do. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. The ghost of Eugenia Peyton seemed to fill the space between them. Well, he said finally, breaking the tension, you must be tired. I am, she agreed. She hesitated at the bedroom door. Good night, husband. The word felt foreign and absurd on her tongue. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Surprise? Annoyance? Good night, wife, he replied, his voice equally strained. Alone in the room, Dorcas leaned against the closed door, her legs finally threatening to give out. She took off the impossibly heavy wedding gown and hung it on a peg. It looked like a specter in the dim light. She changed into her simple nightdress and sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed. The mattress was firm. The sheets smelled of soap and sunshine. It was an intimate space that felt completely alien. What had she done? She had traded her quiet, lonely life for a lie. She was an imposter, a placeholder. She reached for her locket, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She needed the comfort of her mother's tiny portrait. As she opened the locket, she noticed something she hadn't before. A tiny scratch near the hinge. Strange. She'd worn this locket every day for 5 years and had never seen it. She ran her fingernail over it, and to her shock, a false backing popped open. Her mother's portrait was a cover, and behind it, nestled in the hollowed-out space, was not another portrait. It was a small, intricately folded piece of paper. Her hands shaking, Dorcas unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing, a detailed map of the Lazy H Ranch. And in the corner near the old abandoned line shack by Miller's Ridge was a single, starkly drawn X. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't her mother's locket. Somewhere, somehow, her locket had been switched. And this map, this secret hidden message, it had to be from Eugenia Peyton. Dawn broke, painting the prairie in shades of pink and gold. But Dorcas hadn't slept a wink. The map was tucked safely back inside the locket, a cold weight against her skin. She felt like a spy in her own life. She emerged from the bedroom to find the main room empty. Orville was already gone. A mug of coffee sat on the table, along with a note. Gone to check the herds. Back mid-morning. A simple, kind gesture that felt deeply unsettling. Was he a thoughtful stranger or a calculating monster? She didn't know which was worse. She forced herself to act normal. She explored the kitchen, swept the floors, tried to look like the dutiful wife she was pretending to be. But her mind was racing. The map proved one thing. Eugenia Peyton had been to the ranch before. She knew its layout. The X by the abandoned shack. Was that where she was being held? Or was it a meeting place? A place to hide something? Orville returned as the sun climbed high in the sky. He found her kneading dough at the kitchen table, her hands covered in flour. He looked surprised to see her up and working. You needn't have troubled yourself, he said, his voice stiff. It's no trouble, she replied, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady. I have to keep busy. Over a lunch of stew and biscuits that felt like sawdust in her mouth, they made stilted conversation. He talked about cattle prices. She talked about the cost of thread. They were two actors reading from a terrible script. Every time he looked at her, she felt a jolt of fear. Did he know? Did he suspect she was anything other than the simple seamstress she appeared to be? You're still free to pursue your work, he said suddenly, breaking a long silence. This arrangement, it doesn't have to change your ambitions. Was it a generous offer or a warning? A way of saying, stay in your lane, seamstress. Don't get curious. The days that followed were a masterclass in tension. They lived in the same house, shared meals, and spoke in polite, meaningless sentences. Dorcas played her part perfectly. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended his shirts. But every moment she was alone, she studied the map. She tried to picture the layout of the ranch, the location of that shack. It was on the far side of the property, miles from the house. She needed a reason to go there, an excuse that wouldn't raise suspicion. The opportunity came a week later. Orville announced he'd be gone for 2 days, riding to the northern pastures to round up strays. It was her chance. The morning he left, she watched him ride off until he was just a speck on the horizon. Then she sprang into action. She packed a small satchel with water, some food, and a sharp sewing knife. She told the one ranch hand who'd been left behind that she was going to gather wildflowers up on the ridge. A flimsy excuse, but hopefully good enough. The walk was long and arduous. The sun beat down on her, and the prairie grasses tore at the hem of her dress. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the buzz of insects and the cry of a distant hawk. After nearly 2 hours of walking, she saw it. A dilapidated shack tilting sideways, its roof caved in on one side. It looked like it could collapse in the next strong wind. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached. The door hung on a single rusty hinge. She pushed it open, the screech of metal echoing in the stillness. The inside was dark and smelled of dust and decay. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, illuminating swirling motes of dust. And something else. On the dirt floor, in the center of the room, was a patch of earth that had been recently disturbed. It was a small, rectangular area, about the size of a travel trunk. With trembling hands, Dorcas knelt down. She used her knife to dig at the loose soil. It was soft, easy to move. Just a few inches down, her knife hit something hard. Wood. Her breath hitched. She dug faster, her fingers raw, clearing the dirt away. It was a box, a small wooden chest, bound with iron straps. It wasn't locked. Holding her breath, she lifted the heavy lid. She expected to find letters, maybe money, or jewels. Something Eugenia had hidden. She was wrong. The chest was filled with men's clothing, old worn work shirts, a pair of scuffed boots, and tucked in the corner, a small leather-bound journal. Dorcas's hands shook so badly she could barely pick it up. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was masculine, scrawled in faded ink. The first entry was dated 2 years ago, and the name signed at the bottom made all the blood drain from her face. Jeremiah. It was the journal of the man who had left her at the altar. The world spun. Jeremiah. Here, on Husky land? What did this mean? She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the frantic, desperate entries. He hadn't left her. He'd taken a job as a ranch hand at the Lazy H to save up money for their future. He wrote about the brutal work, the long hours. He wrote about her, how much he missed her, how he couldn't wait to come back to Stillwater Creek and marry her. Then the entries started to change. He wrote about seeing things he shouldn't. Lemuel Hask meeting with shadowy figures in the middle of the night, cattle herds that seemed to shrink and grow with no explanation. He suspected Lemuel was a rustler, rebranding stolen cattle and selling them as his own. He was gathering proof. He wrote that he'd hidden his evidence in this chest. The final entry was short, almost illegible, written in a shaky hand. Lemuel knows. He saw me near the canyon. God help me. And that was it. The rest of the pages were blank. Dorcas slammed the journal shut, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Jeremiah hadn't abandoned her. He'd been murdered. Murdered by the family she had just married into. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled out of the shack, gasping for air, the journal clutched in her hand. Lemuel wasn't just a controlling patriarch. He was a thief and a killer. And Orville, did he know? Was his quiet, brooding nature a sign of guilt? Or was he just another pawn in his father's monstrous game? She had to get out of there. She had to get to Sheriff Miller, show him the journal. But as she stood there, her mind reeling, a new, even more terrifying thought struck her. The locket. The map. It wasn't from Eugenia. Eugenia wouldn't know about Jeremiah's secret hiding place. Someone else had given it to her. Someone who knew Jeremiah's secret. Someone who wanted her to find this chest. But who? Who in Stillwater Creek would know? And why? Was it a warning? Or was it a trap? She scanned the horizon, suddenly feeling watched. The vast, empty prairie no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing. And then she saw it. A glint of sunlight reflecting off something metal, high up on the ridge overlooking the shack. Someone was up there, watching her. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't stumbled upon a secret. She had been led to it. She was a puppet, and someone was pulling the strings. She scrambled to her feet and started to run, not back toward the ranch house, but away, toward the faint outline of Stillwater Creek in the distance. She didn't know who her enemy was anymore. It could be anyone. It could be everyone. And as she ran, she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her, getting closer and closer. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a frantic drumming that matched the frantic beating of her own heart. Dorcas didn't dare look back. She just ran, her lungs burning, the dusty hem of her dress tangling in her legs. The prairie offered no cover, no place to hide. She was a mouse in a field and the hawk was circling. The horse was upon her in moments. It cut in front of her, forcing her to a skidding, stumbling stop. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, expecting to see the cold, dead eyes of Orville Hask or the granite scowl of his father. But the man looking down at her from the saddle was someone she never, ever expected to see again. "Dorcas," he said, his voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Jeremiah," she whispered, thinking she was hallucinating, that the sun and the fear had finally broken her mind. It was him, older, leaner, with a scar running through his left eyebrow, but it was undeniably him. He swung down from the horse, his eyes wide. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" He wasn't dead. The journal, the final entry, it was a lie. Or not the whole truth. "They told me you were dead," she choked out, her mind reeling. "I found your journal." "My journal?" He frowned, confused. "Dorcas, what's going on? I saw you from the ridge. I thought you were in trouble." "I am in trouble," she cried, a wave of hysterical relief and terror washing over her. "Jeremiah, the Haskies. They're criminals. I married Orville." The words tumbled out of her in a frantic rush. She told him everything. The missing bride, the forced wedding, the locket, the map, the journal. As she spoke, the look of confusion on his face was replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding. "The locket," he said, his voice grim. "Describe it." She did. A simple silver oval, a gift from her mother. "No," he said, shaking his head. "My mother had one just like it. It had a false back. She kept a small map in it, a map to an emergency cache of money she kept hidden. I told Eugenia about it, in my letters." The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture more terrifying than she could have imagined. "Eugenia? You were writing to her?" Dorcas asked, a new kind of pain lancing through her. "Yes," he admitted, his face clouding with guilt. "After I left Stillwater, I took a job as an investigator for the Pinkerton Agency. Her father hired me 6 months ago. He was suspicious of Lemuel Haskey, thought he was a swindler. He sent me to investigate him undercover. I got a job at the ranch. That's when I found out the truth. He's not just a rustler. He's tied to a criminal syndicate that runs his whole territory. I started writing to Eugenia, warning her not to come." "So the journal," she began, "was a plant," he finished for her. "I knew they were watching me. I left it there for them to find, to make them think I was dead or had run off. I had to disappear before I could get my evidence to the marshals. But I never dreamed they'd involve you in this." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Dorcas, leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. I was going to come back for you, I swear it. But Eugenia was my assignment," he said firmly. "Nothing more. I told her about the locket, about the secret compartment. She must have had one made, a duplicate of yours. She was supposed to use that map to find the evidence I'd hidden, not the fake journal." A cold dread settled in Dorcas's stomach. "So the locket I have, it was meant for Eugenia. Someone switched them." "Which means someone knew you were the key," Jeremiah said, his eyes scanning the horizon nervously. "They used you. They led you right to that shack, right to that fake journal. They wanted you to believe I was dead and that the Haskies were responsible." "But why?" she cried. "To isolate you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "To make you terrified of your new husband. To make you run." "But who—" Suddenly a voice, smooth as silk and cold as a grave, drifted over the prairie. "It's always a pleasure to see a plan come together." They both spun around, standing not 20 feet away, holding a pearl-handled Derringer pistol, was the town's prim and proper schoolmarm, Ethelinda Crane. Ethelinda? Dorcas gasped, utterly bewildered. Ethelinda smiled, but it was a chilling, predatory expression. I do prefer my married name, dear. Mrs. Puett. And stepping out from behind her, holding a rifle leveled at Jeremiah's chest, was the town banker, Thurston Puett. What is the meaning of this? Jeremiah demanded, instinctively moving to shield Dorcas. The meaning, Thurston said with a smug grin, is that the Haskell Empire is about to crumble, and we'll be there to pick up the pieces. It was you, Dorcas breathed, the truth hitting her with the force of a physical blow. You switched the lockets. You gave me the map to the fake journal. Clever girl, Ethelinda cooed. Lemuel Hask is a monster, it's true. A thief and a killer. But he's also rich. Very, very rich. And very, very over-leveraged. My husband here holds the notes on his entire ranch. We knew Jeremiah was getting close to exposing him, Thurston explained, his eyes glittering with greed. So we decided to help things along. We orchestrated Eugenia's disappearance. You kidnapped her? Dorcas was horrified. Heavens, no, Ethelinda laughed, a sound like breaking glass. That would be so messy. We simply sent her a telegram, pretending to be from her father, telling her the engagement was off and that she was to return to Boston immediately. She was on a train heading east before Orville even put on his wedding suit. But the overturned coach, the dead driver, Jeremiah began. A bit of stagecraft, Thurston said proudly. A dead vagrant and a broken wheel, enough to start a panic, enough to force Lemuel's hand. We knew he'd need a substitute bride, Ethelinda continued, her eyes fixed on Dorcas. A local girl, someone quiet, respectable, with no family to ask questions. You were perfect, and we knew, once you were married into that nest of vipers, your fear would make you the perfect weapon against them. You wanted me to find the journal and run to the sheriff, Dorcas realized. You wanted me to be the one to destroy them. Precisely, Thurston nodded. With Lemuel and Orville arrested for Jeremiah's murder, the ranch would default. The bank, my bank, would foreclose. We'd get everything. The land, the cattle, the power. But I'm not dead, Jeremiah said, his hand slowly inching toward the pistol on his hip. Ethelinda's smile widened. No, you're not. That is a loose end we'll have to tie up, along with this one. She gestured at Dorcas with her derringer. It's a shame, really. I was rather looking forward to seeing the Haskell men hang. But having you both disappear will work just as well. A tragic accident, perhaps. The distraught bride and her former lover, lost on the prairie. You won't get away with this, Jeremiah growled. Oh, I think we will, Thurston said. He began to raise his rifle. But in that split second, another sound cut through the air, the sharp crack of a different rifle, from a different direction. Thurston Puett cried out and crumpled to the ground, his own rifle clattering in the dust. Ethelinda screamed, spinning around, her derringer firing wildly, and striding over the ridge, his face a mask of cold fury, his rifle smoking, was Orville Hask. Get away from my wife, Orville snarled, his voice a low thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Ethelinda, her face a mask of shocked fury, turned her derringer on Dorcas. Don't come any closer, Haskell, or the seamstress gets it. But she had underestimated Dorcas. In that moment of distraction, Dorcas lunged, not away from the gun, but toward it. She slammed her body into Ethelinda, grabbing the woman's wrist with both hands. The tiny pistol fired, the shot going wild, searing the air next to Dorcas's ear. They tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs and skirts. Ethelinda was wiry and strong, her fingers like claws, but Dorcas was fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. She brought her knee up hard into Ethelinda's stomach. The woman gasped, her grip loosening for just a second. It was all Dorcas needed. She twisted the gun from Ethelinda's hand and scrambled away, panting, the warm metal of the derringer clutched in her fist. Meanwhile, Orville and Jeremiah were closing in on the wounded Thurston Puett. The banker was clutching his shoulder, his face pale with pain and terror. It was all her idea, he whimpered, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. I just handled the money. Orville ignored him. His eyes were only for Dorcas. He saw that she was safe, and a wave of visible relief washed over his face. He strode over to her. gently taking the derringer from her trembling hand. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, unable to speak. His stormy eyes then fell on Jeremiah. The two men sized each other up, a silent, tense standoff over the woman between them. "So you're the ghost," Orville said, his voice flat. "And you're the devil she married," Jeremiah retorted, his hand still resting on the butt of his pistol. "Enough!" Dorcas cried, finding her voice. "He saved my life. And you? Why are you here? I thought you were in the northern pastures." "One of the hands saw you riding out this way," Orville said, his gaze locked on her face. "He said you looked spooked. I had a bad feeling, so I followed you." His eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "It seems my feelings were correct." The sound of more horses approaching made them all turn. Sheriff Miller, followed by Lemuel Hask and a half-dozen ranch hands, came riding over the ridge. Lemuel took in the scene in an instant. The wounded banker, the furious schoolmarm held at gunpoint by his son, the strange man standing next to his daughter-in-law. "What in blue blazes is going on here?" the old man roared. And so the whole sordid story came pouring out. Ethelinda and Thurston, seeing their plan in ruins, began turning on each other, spitting accusations like venom. Jeremiah, flashing his Pinkerton badge, laid out the details of their conspiracy. But it was Dorcas who held everyone's attention. She stood tall and told them everything, from the forced marriage to the discovery in the shack. When she finished, a stunned silence fell over the group. Lemuel Haskey stared at her, his icy eyes filled with a new, grudging respect. He looked at the sniveling banker and the murderous schoolmarm, and then back at the small, quiet seamstress who had just saved his family's name, even after he had so brutally used her to do it. Sheriff Miller arrested the Puets, hauling them away to face justice. As they were being led off, Ethelinda shot Dorcas a look of pure, undiluted hatred. "You may have won today, little seamstress," she hissed, "but you're still married to a Haskey. There's no escaping that curse." The words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy. With the immediate danger gone, the tension between Orville and Jeremiah returned, thicker than ever. "The conspiracy is dealt with," Jeremiah said, his eyes on Dorcas. "But there are other matters to settle. Dorcas, you don't have to stay here. This marriage is a sham. You can have it annulled. You can come with me." He held out his hand to her. It was the moment she had dreamed of for 2 long years. The man she thought she'd lost returned from the dead, offering her a way out, an escape from the lies and the darkness of the Haskey family. She looked at Jeremiah, at his outstretched hand, the promise of a life she once wanted so desperately. Then she looked at Orville. He stood silent, his face unreadable, his stormy eyes giving nothing away. He didn't plead. He didn't make a promise. He just watched her, his jaw tight, waiting for her decision. It should have been an easy choice. The hero versus the villain. Love versus a lie. But as she stood there on that sun-scorched patch of prairie, Dorcas realized it wasn't that simple. The last week had changed her. Facing down murderers and unearthing secrets had forged something in her. Something hard and strong. She looked at Orville, at the man who had followed her into danger. The man who had just declared her my wife with a ferocity that had shaken her to her core. He was a mystery, a man trapped in his father's web, but in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she didn't see in Jeremiah's. She saw a man who needed her. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. Jeremiah's hand fell. "No? My place is here," she said, her gaze steady on Orville. "I am Mrs. Hask. This is my home now, and I don't run from my home." A muscle jumped in Orville's jaw. It was the only sign that her words had affected him. Lemuel Haskey let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man said, looking at Dorcas as if seeing her for the first time. The girl's got steel in her spine. Jeremiah stared at her, his face a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Dorcas, you can't be serious. After everything they've done?" "I know what they've done," she said, her voice dropping. "And there will be a reckoning for that too. But that's a family matter." She turned and walked to Orville's side. It was a declaration, a choice. She was no longer a pawn. She was a player, and the game had just begun. As Jeremiah mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure disappearing into the vastness of the prairie, Dorcas stood beside her husband, a stranger bound to her by a crime and a lie. The villains were caught, but the mystery was far from over. She had chosen her side. Now she would have to live with the consequences. And as she looked up at the cold, handsome face of Orville Hask, she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was heavy, charged with everything that had just happened, with everything that was still unsaid. Dorcas rode beside Orville, intensely aware of him, of the power in the way he held the reins, the grim set of his jaw. He had saved her life. He had called her his wife, but he hadn't said a single word since they'd left the shack. Lemuel rode ahead, a thundercloud on horseback. When they reached the main homestead, the old man dismounted and turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "The girl was right," he said, his voice a low growl. "There will be a reckoning." He looked from Orville to Dorcas. "In my study, now." The study was Lemuel's fortress, a room of dark wood and leather that smelled of old books and cigar smoke. He poured 3 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Orville and, to Dorcas's surprise, one to her. He downed his own in a single gulp. "I owe you my thanks, girl," he said, his voice grudging. "And my life," Orville added quietly, his eyes on Dorcas. "You saved us from ruin. The Pewits would have destroyed everything." "They would have," Lemuel agreed. "But they were only a symptom. The disease runs deeper." He looked at his son. "Jeremiah, the Pinkerton. He wasn't wrong about me, Orville. The rustling, the back alley deals. It's all true. I did what I had to do to build this ranch, to protect our name." "And Jeremiah?" Dorcas asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened to him?" Lemuel sighed, the sound like rocks grinding together. "He got too close. He found my ledger. I didn't kill him. I'm a thief, not a murderer. I had my men persuade him to leave the territory. We burned his camp, made it look like he'd vanished. I never imagined he'd come back." Orville's face was pale. "You lied to me, Father. You let me believe you were an honest man." "Honesty doesn't build empires," Lemuel shot back. "It gets you a dirt plot and a wooden marker. I did this for you, for our legacy." The 2 men stared at each other, a lifetime of secrets and resentments crackling in the air between them. Dorcas felt like an intruder, a witness to a war that had been raging for years. "So what now?" she asked quietly, breaking the standoff. Both men turned to look at her. "The Pinkertons won't let this go," she continued, her confidence growing with every word. "Jeremiah will report back. They will come for you, Lemuel, and they will take everything." Lemuel's face darkened. "Let them try." "No," Orville said, his voice firm. He stepped forward, placing himself between his father and Dorcas. "There will be no more lies, no more hiding. We will handle this the right way." He looked at his father, and for the first time Dorcas saw the son eclipse the father. "Tomorrow," Orville said, "I will ride to the next town and wire the U.S. Marshals. I will give them everything. The ledger, a full confession of your crimes. We will pay what we owe, restore what was stolen. We will clean the Haskey name, not by bearing the truth, but by facing it." Lemuel looked like he'd been struck. "You would betray your own father?" "I would save him," Orville countered. "Would you rather rot in a federal prison or live out your days on this ranch, stripped of your power, but with your son by your side?" The old man stared, his icy eyes searching Orville's face. He saw no weakness, no hesitation. He saw a man. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to drain all the fight out of him, Lemuel sank into his leather chair. "Do what you must," he whispered, looking suddenly old and frail. The fight was over. Orville had won. He turned to Dorcas, his expression softening as he looked at her. "As for us," he said, his voice dropping, "our marriage was built on a lie. I won't hold you to it. Jeremiah was right. You can have it annulled. You are free to go." He said the words, but his eyes told a different story. In their stormy depths, she saw a desperate plea. He was offering her an escape, but he was praying she wouldn't take it. She thought of the life that awaited her back in Stillwater Creek, her small, lonely room, her quiet, empty future. Then she thought of the last few days, the terror, the danger, the adrenaline. She had never felt so alive. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, and she had found it here, with him. "You once told me this arrangement needn't change my ambitions," she said softly, echoing his own words back to him. "Perhaps my ambitions have changed." He took a step closer, his hands finding hers. They were warm and strong. "Dorcas, why? Why would you stay?" "Because," she said, her voice clear and certain, "I think the seamstress of Stillwater Creek has found something worth fighting for. And I think the cattle baron of the Lazy H has too." A slow smile spread across Orville's face, transforming his harsh features, making him look younger, freer. "My father was right about one thing," he murmured, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "You have steel in your spine, Dorcas Ellery." "It's Haskey now," she corrected him gently. "Dorcas Haskey." He pulled her closer, his gaze intense, searching her face. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice husky. "To be Dorcas Haskey?" She didn't need words. She simply rose on her toes and met his lips with hers. And this time there was no hesitation, no cold contract. It was a kiss full of fire and promise. A kiss that sealed not a deal, but a partnership. A kiss that marked the true beginning of their marriage. In the aftermath, life on the Lazy H was transformed. Orville was true to his word. He rode out and met with the U.S. Marshals. He handed over his father's ledgers, detailing years of rustling and illegal dealings. He negotiated a settlement. The Haskeys were forced to pay enormous restitution, selling off nearly two-thirds of their land and half their herds to compensate the ranchers Lemuel had stolen from. The Haska empire was humbled, reduced to the modest ranch house Orville had built with his own hands. Lemuel, stripped of his power and wealth, became a ghost in his own life. He retreated into a bitter silence, spending his days on the porch, watching his legacy crumble to dust. But as the empire shrank, something else grew in its place. Orville and Dorcas, working side by side from sunup to sundown, began to build something new, something honest. They discovered each other in the quiet moments, sharing a cup of coffee at dawn, mending a fence together under the hot afternoon sun, talking late into the night by the fire. He learned about the fiancé who had abandoned her, and she learned about the mother he'd lost too young. The barriers between them crumbled, replaced by a deep and abiding tenderness. Their marriage, born of coercion and deceit, was reforged in shared hardship and mutual respect. The awkwardness was replaced by easy laughter, the silence by comfortable companionship. One night, months after the Marshalls had left and their new, smaller life had found its rhythm, Orville came in from the barn, his face weary but content. Dorcas was sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts, the simple, domestic act feeling more real and intimate than any grand gesture. He sat on the floor at her feet, leaning his head back against her knees. She put down her sewing, her fingers gently combing through his thick dark hair. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his voice muffled. "About what?" she asked. "That day at the church. When I stood at that altar, I thought my life was over. I thought my father had ruined me." He turned his head, looking up at her, his stormy eyes clear and bright in the firelight. "But he didn't ruin me, Dorcas. He led me to you. Being left at the altar wasn't the worst moment of my life. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I never dreamed," she whispered, "that a life I was forced into could become the only life I ever wanted." He rose to his knees, his hands cupping her face. "I love you, Dorcas Haska," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Not as a solution, not as a convenience. I love you for your strength, for your courage. I love you." "And I love you," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The seasons turned. The scandal in Stillwater Creek faded into gossip, then into legend. The story of the seamstress who saved the Haskey Ranch became a cautionary tale about marrying for power, and a hopeful one about the surprising nature of love. A year to the day after their chaotic wedding, Dorcas stood on the porch of their small house, watching the sunset paint the sky. Orville came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Her belly was swollen with their first child. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I was just thinking," she said, leaning back against his strong chest, "that sometimes the most beautiful things are stitched together from the most unlikely threads." He smiled, his hand resting protectively on her stomach, where their future was growing. They had lost an empire, but they had found a world built not on lies or power, but on the simple, unshakable foundation of two people who had found each other in the ruins and decided to build something better together. The story of Dorcas and Orville became a quiet legend in that part of the country, a reminder that fate has a strange and often brutal way of showing you where you truly belong. They faced down murderers, liars, and the ghosts of their own past, and came out the other side stronger than anyone could have imagined. They proved that a marriage forced by circumstance can become a love chosen by the heart. And it just goes to show you that sometimes the most terrifying day of your life is just the first page of your greatest adventure. If you enjoyed this wild ride through Stillwater Creek and you want to hear more stories about dark secrets and unexpected heroes, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and get ready for the next strange story. You won't want to miss it.